Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today I'm grateful to have a Business of Biotech MVP on the show, Allan Shaw. Allan has been a five-time public company COO. He's served on a number of board of directors, and I'm happy to have him here to talk about a very timely subject, Chinese biotech, which has become something of a go-to source of innovation for global big pharma and biotech alike. Deal activity has been robust in recent months. To use just one example, Merck has since last November announced three multi-billion dollar out-licensing deals with Chinese biotech companies. And Merck is certainly not the only company doing deals in China and eyeing new opportunities. Lilly and Novo Nordisk are two other recent examples of companies doing big deals in China. But fortunately, we have Allan on as our guest to explain what's behind China's growing biopharmaceutical industry and why Western companies have become so keen on Chinese biotech and what it all means. Thanks for being here, Allan.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Always glad to be here and quite excited to do an episode with you now. Missed
Yeah,
that, but really looking forward to chatting about China with you and the episodes that go forward from here.
likewise, Allan. Thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to move on from Matt and be on an episode with me. More to come.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, a lot of big pharmas set up affiliates in China in the 1990s in anticipation, I think, of China's growing middle class, expanded healthcare benefits, with the idea of commercializing more products for the Chinese market. But that's not really what we're talking about today. Of course, that's still happening, but what we're talking about is the dramatic growth of China's own biotech industry over the last decade. Um, Allan, what is driving that surge and how did we get here?
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution that we've been witnessing. And, I would say that China's rise in biotech is the result of a deliberate and well-executed strategy that combines policy, talent, and capital investment. But there's several factors that I think specifically have really been drivers behind this. You know, we've done a really good job of training a lot of Chinese top scientists here in the United States. And we've done such a good job that they've been able to bring back this world-class expertise and repopulate that very effectively over in China and have developed very strong networks. The Chinese government have also prioritized biotech as a strategic industry and they've been providing a lot of funding and incentives to help drive innovation and really grow that. When I was over in Suzhou prior to COVID, it was like walking in Cambridge, really, and
Hmm.
that's really part of the greater Shanghai hub that we'll be hearing more and more about in the future. They have really a much lower cost workforce. Their PhDs are literally a dime a dozen over there. And that really enables much more cost-effective ways of doing things uh, compared to other parts of the world. And their regulatory environment is also, perhaps some people would argue, a little loose, but it does enable faster pathways, making it an interesting place for development, but certainly been a very fertile area for R&D right now. And so all of these factors have really created a dynamic biotech ecosystem that is really starting to really step onto the global stage. And, look forward to talking about, the implications.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I mentioned in the intro, Western pharma companies have been increasingly striking deals with Chinese biotech firms. I gave a couple of examples in Merck and Lilly and Novo, which were just the couple that occurred to me. Can you quantify how significant that shift has become?
Yes, it's there. It's growing like a weed. You only have to go back, 5 years ago, and approximately, if you look at $50 million as your threshold cutoff, that represented about 5% of the global deals were originated out of China. You fast forward to this past year, according to data out there, and there's now that represents almost 30% of the deals that are licensed are originating out of China.
Wow.
That's really a significantly exponential growth, and it involves, like, besides Merck, AZ, GSK, and as you touched on, there was a recent Merck LP little a deal, and we'll be hearing a lot more about LP little a as a clinical standard of care in cardiology. But there's opportunities, to say the least. And not only are the strategics going over there, but there's a lot of investors also going over there and taking advantage of the opportunity to really harvest the crops, and the availability of assets over there. Bain, RTW are pouring hundreds of $1 million into Chinese biotechs. And the rationale for this is a confluence of factors. The Chinese companies are producing high quality drugs, often biosimilars, or no, biobetters, actually, not biosimilars, that enhance existing therapies at a fraction of Western development costs. As I referenced, their inputs are just so much less. Um, and also, what's contributed to this is their capital market system has really blown up over there. So, you've
Hmm.
got a lot of needy companies. I guess they're even needier than ours. And so right now, because so many of them are also clustering around similar targets, it's really, giving a whole new meaning to Chinese menus. And they're really, so it's really a buyer's market in China right now. And what I think underscores some of that, and this is according to a recent white paper that Locust Walk put out, um, that the upfront payments are significantly lower than those in the that paid from the United States, almost like 2 times lower. Um, like you're paying almost 5%. I think if you used US metrics, the upfront used to represent about 10% of the total deal value. Now, if you go into China, you're paying about 5%. So
Hmm.
that's a big difference, and it makes it
Yeah,
a
smaller
lot.
up front. Yeah.
Yeah. And this shift really underscores the growing role of Chinese biotech in global innovation landscape, and highlights the increasing appetite of companies for accessing these low cost effective assets. It also implies that there is money that's leaving the traditional ecosystem as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the government heavily subsidizing the biotech industry in China. And, we've seen this in other sectors as well in electric cars. Everybody heard about DeepSeek in AI. And it seems like and just thinking about those two industries, what they have in common seemingly is that they're creating a technology, similar or better to what exists in other global markets, and yet significantly cheaper. Aside from it, how are they able to do that? I guess aside from, is it all government subsidies that allows, the Chinese market to develop drugs, to build electric cars, to create AI algorithms and apps more cheaply?
It's really a great question, and I think you can go a lot of different places with it. But you can also look at how we do things, and I think there's a lot of legacy practices in the way we develop drugs. We spend a lot of time on animal models, yet how many times, and then we often say these animal models don't translate. But
Right.
so you're putting a lot of layers in your process there. We can talk about the clinical drug process too. That's got a lot of layers of yesterday built into that. And there are probably more effective, more cost-effective ways, particularly when you start looking at developing the drugs for chronic diseases, where you need multiple phase twos, you need to power these studies. And what you're doing is you're selling a suit off the rack. And we know that people aren't off the rack. So, there's a lot of disconnects from, what we're doing in the studies. So, when you superimpose that back to China, they're not necessarily doing that. They're cutting out a lot of the upfront animal work, and they go right into humans. And I often quip that human models translate so much better.
Yeah. Yeah, right. No, that's a really interesting point. They may not have those same kinds of, incremental base costs, that big pharma has developed over years, some of which, is probably wasteful or needs to be redesigned to be more efficient. They may not have those same base costs in China.
Absolutely. And now, if you're going to be, scouting and trying to bring in assets, are you going to be better with a molecule or an antibody that's been in man? Or are you going to be happier with a molecule that's been in a mouse or a rat or a monkey for that matter?
I
So,
know what I'd be happier with. Yeah.
no, so and so you can really de-risk things and run the so-called killer experiment a lot sooner and get better results that translate. And because costs are cheaper over there, you have cost advantages besides speed and efficiency. And the science has become very, 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 very good over there.
Yeah.
There's certainly they've come up with the new PD-L1 VEGF that Kizo's developing with Summit, but there's a lot of other great things that they're doing over there. And then as you touched on, depending on your partnerships, you could potentially open up access to, a population of billions.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I saw a Simon Cooker report recently that showed in 2023, which was the most recent data in the report, 39% of all clinical trials, phase 1 through 4, were happening in China in 2023, which was, a dramatic increase just in, the 5 years prior to 2023, which I think reflects that, continuing interest in commercializing drugs in China, but it also reflects, what you're talking about, the growing amount of Chinese initiated clinical research and the real strength in R&D that they've developed.
No, indeed. And I think you need to also distinguish between the studies that are being run for commercialization purposes in China versus those that are being run
Yeah.
to straight efficacy as well. Because at least some of the noise that I've been hearing from folks when I talk about, this new trend or phenomena, or it's hard to call it a phenomena, it's real. Um, but it is the fact that I think people find that it's a great place to get early stage stuff. I don't think people are really relying on, for a lot of reasons, on the stuff that's being developed
Yeah.
in the clinic from the baseline drug development, and the perception is that I guess they have not imported enough chops in order to actually do the clinical development in a way that people would feel comfortable with. Um, and
Yeah, I think the FDA has more or less kind of expressed that view, not to mention the fact that I think there's some pretty strict Chinese laws about transferring health data from Chinese nationals outside of the country. So I don't know, if that prevents some of the exchange or back and forth in clinical development programs. Obviously, in most countries, you have to conduct clinical trials in the country where you want to commercialize a drug. Not always the case. It sort of depends on some circumstances, but I've had some people, more than one person mention that to me as something that I think there are workarounds that have been established, but nevertheless, it's not as easy as conducting a phase two trial in China or a phase three trial in China and, submitting that to the FDA, to get a drug approved in the US, as Lilly found out, with their PD-1 back in 2022.
No, exactly. I think the playbook is to get the asset early and then develop it yourself before it can be screwed up, or and do it on with your goalposts, your measurements, and answer the questions under your control, and with assurance that the underlying data is reflective of the experiments.
Yeah. So strong preclinical assets, not at a premium, at a lower cost, for acquisition. Is that what's primarily driving Western big pharma and investors to seek out Chinese biotech partnerships and deals?
Yeah, and I think they're looking at later stage programs too, depending on the expertise. But yeah, I think you've nailed that, and it really gives them the opportunity to backfill their pipeline. Because it does beg a question of what they're going to do with their own internal R&D resources, because they've really, I think they can probably put those functions on a diet. In some regards, I don't see the productivity or the yield coming from those areas. But yeah, I think that's going to be part of the playbook. I think, ultimately Shanghai, the Shanghai hub will be uttered in the same breath as San Diego, San Francisco, and Boston. Like I said earlier, when I was in Suzhou, I was, it had the same kind of feel and energy as walking around Cambridge. You couldn't step anywhere without going crushing a molecule. Um, so I do think it offers, I think what you're going to get to is, historically the Chinese companies have been more of a fast follower, I
Right.
think, and and I think people have been feeling very comfortable with them in that role. But I think it's still ultimately causing a problem with the as far as supply and demand is concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned the patent cliff because I think that has to be at least part of the reason why some of these deals are getting done, right? We have a kind of not since what 2007 or 2010, a pretty substantial patent cliff for a lot of big pharma companies coming in the next couple of years, right?
Oh no, indeed, and that's been the speculation that these guys have a pile of cash and they'll be doing deals, and it hasn't necessarily played out that way right now,
Right.
and people are scratching their heads, and that's probably for a separate discussion. But the IPO market isn't working, the M&A market isn't working. It's causing a little bit of consternation in the marketplace, and I think this dynamic too it allows companies, rather than buying companies, right? Rather than buying a cow, you can go to China and buy the steak.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah.
it does give people options, but you have to ask yourself, is this kind of can potentially, not only is it redirecting resources out of the United States, but are we potentially also cannibalizing a little bit of the M&A dynamic that's kind of been an important pillar in how the capital markets for biopharmaceuticals work.
Yeah. Well, Alan, I'm going to have you back on, and we'll dig into this issue of the broken IPO market and what companies can do. We'll save that for a future episode. Going back to China, are there specific drug types or therapeutic areas that companies are really looking to China for? And we've already alluded to or discussed the PD-1s and how effective Chinese biotech has gotten at developing those. But what else? What other drug types are, and maybe it's not a specific one or two. Maybe it's all across the map. I'm not sure.
No, it's interesting to see how where they're really carving out their differentiation and being competitive. And I think people ask, are they really being bio betters or are they innovating? And I think the general perspective has been that they've been kind of me too's or me betters, is what I've heard a lot of people he talk about. But they've been doing that so well and so prolifically now that, you're seeing competition coming out of the woodwork. And people are being blindsided. I think it undermines the confidence of when you do a review of the competitive landscape and having conviction that you've got your arms around it because there is so much of that going on over there. Um, but I do think the innovation is bubbling under the surface. I recently was advised that based on the number of patents that have been issued or filed. China is actually kicking our butts. And
Really?
yeah, so the innovation is bubbling under the surface. So while today they're known as innovators, and I think we've still got an innovative heads up on them, they are catching up very quickly. And to your question, they've proven themselves to be very, very good at making antibodies. They've been being able to make the ADCs, which have been very that have been selling like hotcakes.
Yeah, not an easy product to make either.
No, so they've really been able to do a good job on those. I understand, they're doing a good job on bispecifics, so they've got the antibodies down, and I think they've gotten everybody's attention on that. But they're also, the chemists are very good too. So, they can certainly go toe to toe with anybody on small molecules. And I think that's really where the general focus is. They haven't been as prolific in the cell that I've seen in the cell or gene therapy space, and I think that's also a very costly modality, and that's not the way their medical system operates. But I think it's those two particular modalities that they've done really well. And typically, what they do is they tweak the chemistry, they enhance efficacy a little bit, improve safety profiles rather than traditionally doing the innovative first mover drugs. But as I said, they are moving forward, and I think we gotta take them seriously uh,
Yeah,
because I think they can create and they are creating dislocation in the system that we've previously understood.
right. And we've been talking about this question of innovation, which you're saying is bubbling up versus kind of the refining of existing drugs, incrementally improving existing drugs. Do you anticipate Chinese, the emergence of a Chinese big pharma that is doing more global trials, bringing more products into the US that were originated in China and maybe initially studied with a phase three or maybe two and three conducted as part of a global trial system in the US and then approved in the US? I mean, are we still a ways away from that, or is that on the near horizon?
And I think the U.S. represents a big market, so I think naturally it would make sense for companies to do that. Uh,
Certainly some have, yeah.
yeah, I think it has been done, and I think there are smaller companies that are migrating over. One of the more successful IPOs this year, Ascentage, is basically a company that's come from over there, and they're executing very very well. So yeah, I think you're going to see that. There's no question about it. Particularly, and I think part of what will influence that too is how their capital market system works. There was a period of time where if you had a choice. I was involved with one of those companies. You could go. I remember when I got involved, I said, "Are we looking east or are we looking west?" Uh, right now, I think you can only look west, but the Western model is like we've said has its own issues, but it's still looking better than the others. And I think the one thing that we have here in the United States, and this is one we have to be careful about, is we have the ecosystem. We've created a really, really robust ecosystem, and it's the envy of the world. That's why you got a lot of European companies, a lot of companies out of Israel. You have companies from Asia who come in over here, not only for our capital markets, but it's for our infrastructure. And China is certainly, may ultimately come to a point where people find that to be a fertile place to go to. And I think it has its purpose. But right now, the capital markets, there doesn't have the complete ecosystem. Um, so I still think we have a leg up, but I think we also should not take our system for granted. And I think there's a high risk of that. I mean, you know, um, I think what's going on today, unlike when the Russians put rockets in space. And that kind of was a wake-up call to the US to kind of harness our technology. And then we had the so-called space race that JFK initiated. At this point in time, when we're basically getting a shot across our bow, that China is a real emerging biotech competitor for leadership, our response is to blow up the NIH.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it's a bit ironic, and I think there's an opportunity for course correction, but we shouldn't just take it for granted.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I did want to ask you, how you think some of those U.S. policies, NIH funding cuts, tariffs, alter the competitive landscape. I was speaking to a gentleman who has a really interesting book coming out in late April called "So Small." It's a history of germ theory, and he is the head of science writing at MIT. He's a professor there, but also an author. And what he was telling me is that when you stop funding, something like the NIH, freeze research grants, even for 6 months, much less like a 4-year period potentially, you don't just pick up where you left off. You actually really lose some not just people and programs, but also just knowledge. He referenced, in the lab that, the single guy who knows to knock twice on the side of the machine to make it work right, who once he's gone, no one knows how to do that. And you just the knowledge is lost. And he was quite concerned about that. But anyway, Alan, what do you think some of these U.S. policies might do to affect the competitive landscape?
Yeah, yeah, I think long term, you can't measure the near-term implications of doing something at the NIH because because the lead time of development and their impact is usually felt, a generation
Years
later.
later, yeah.
So it's one of those things that you can do for short-term gratification. And I think as a general premise, all this funding has kind of become like an entitlement, and people have viewed these things as entitlements, and that's not a good thing either.
Right.
Um, so, I think, doing something that's a little bit more freestanding and challenging the status quo of how we allocate resources, I think makes infinite sense if it's done in rational, thoughtful manner. I mean, I kind of hate to think how much money the government has spent on supporting the amyloid plaque hypothesis. I mean, I'm sure there's a small fortune was there. So, we got to be thoughtful about how we do things. But I think those are longer term implications. I think stuff that can have bigger implications are things that kind of view things that put barriers around global medicine. It's global medicine. This is about humanity and, trying to kind of artificially um, tether that to geographical boundaries seems a bit unnatural in the spirit of helping mankind. Um, so, to me, the Biosecure Act didn't make a lot of sense. It seemed to be highly disruptive. It's adding cost and delays, arguably, to bringing drugs to market as opposed to helping people uh, do that. Um, if there's disrespect on respecting IP, that's a different issue, and you need to
Yeah,
address it differently. But so from my perspective, I think the a lot of these policies are not particularly helpful. Uh, but I guess it's through the eyes of the beholder and what you're trying to solve for.
right.
If this is all about patients, and I've always thought that, at the end of the day, while a lot of people make money on this and it is a profitable way of doing so, I thought this was still all about patients and about, if you do the right thing for patients, everything else takes care of itself. And somehow we're getting that's getting lost in translation when it comes down to that. I think as an industry, we can do a much better job in terms of resource allocation. I mean, how do you get 100 CAR T CD19 companies? Look at
Yeah,
what's going on in obesity right now. It's actually somewhat obese. Um,
yeah. Obese pipelines. Yeah,
yeah, so it's we have to be smarter about how we allocate. It's such a lemming approach. Why do we need so many checkpoint PDL1s out there? All we're doing is actually commoditizing good science. And so, we sow the seeds to a lot of these problems, and it's, you have to ask yourself, who wrote the check for that 100th CD19 company? Who thought that was a good idea?
yeah, yeah. Right. Well, uh, tariffs, Peter Navarro saber rattling aside, what are the potential downsides, if there are any, of China's growing role in biotech, particularly for U.S. and European companies?
The biggest concern is China's ability to produce high quality drugs at lower costs, which can really disrupt the financing models here in the US and Europe, as we've touched on. Their ability to do that kind of, as we touched on, I think can really put the M&A market at risk. And, it's going to put more pressure on companies to actually launch their own products, commercialize their own products. And I think it does challenge one of the underpinnings of how the capital markets currently work. M&A has been a big driver of returns, and I've actually written an article in the past saying that at times when the market's been hot, it's almost akin to a casino mentality as far as who people think is going to be the next takeout. I mean, so, people have companies circled up. So if there are things that are playing out as a consequence of China's emergence, that's kind of given people an alternative to that channel, that's going to have its implications at the end of the day. And
Yeah,
I don't see any getting around that. Um, and it's also going to hit the valuations of companies and hit their cost of capital because if they're basically resetting the prices, not only for drug prices that are commercial, but what are the trade values of a phase 1 asset or a phase 2 asset? You know, your valuations are going to be impacted too. Uh, so, there's a ripple effect. Yeah, I wouldn't call them the drunks that came to the party, but it has that kind of potential implication on the way the model has traditionally uh, worked. Certainly, I think the Me Too's is going to kind of make things, branded products, become almost generic before their time. Uh,
Hmm.
I think that it'll give a new meaning to a branded generic in certain respects. Um, well, and from a national security perspective, concerns persist around the IP protection and over-reliance on Chinese supply lines.
Yeah.
Um, so, going back to what I said, I don't want to poo-poo them, but I think in the context of what trying to solve for or address, it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog. And I would suggest that there's different ways to try to mitigate those risks. Um, but the whole thing, so many people work with Woozy and Woozy may have, be having data that may be ultimately very competitive somewhere down the road. And, I guess that's a business decision. And I think you can make the decision on that. But I think there's other Chinese suppliers. You don't have to work with Woozy uh,
Yeah.
as well. So, if these trends continue, they are reshaping the competitive landscape and do pose long-term challenges. Um, I don't think people really want to think about it, but it's here, it's now, and it's not going away. And as I understand it, the U.S. government's actually going to be putting out a paper in the first week in April that's going to be talking a little bit more about this. So
Oh, really?
it'll
Okay.
it'll be interesting, guys. When I was at the Callan conference not that long ago, they had a couple of representatives, and there was actually a subcommittee appointed by the Senate looking at biotech innovation. So they were trying to tie this in, and but it seems to me the bigger issue is that they're working on executive order expansion of powers and
Yeah.
overspending. And I think that this is where this is all going to kind of rubber hits the road.
Oh, okay. So you talked about additional risk associated with Chinese biotech based on, some of the existing economic models in US and Europe. But what about for patients? Is because one of the whole cases that Eli Lilly was making with their PD1, PDL, PD1 back in 2022 that was ultimately declined by the FDA was that it would be they'd offer it at something like a 40% discount to the other immune cancer immunotherapies that were on the market at the time. And I remember Richard Pazder saying, well, FDA doesn't consider cost, but I think people heard that and thought, well, if we can get this, you know, bio better essentially, or some sort of equal cancer product at a much lower cost, wouldn't that be good for patients? What do you think about that? Do you think Chinese biotech's presence and the growth of Chinese biotech is ultimately good or ultimately bad for patients?
I think it in the short term, China's growing biotech presence, I think, is great for patients. I think it'll bring down costs and make drugs much cheaper, and lead to better access over in the short term. However, the long-term picture is a lot more complex. If traditional biotech funding models break down, incentives for high risk, high reward innovation could diminish. This may result in fewer first-in-class breakthroughs and more incremental improvements, potentially slowing the pace of medical advancement.
Hmm.
I think our risk reward model works pretty well, and I think it's become the envy of the world, and China's doing a really good job of emulating it. Are there things that we can do better, more efficiently? Absolutely. Um, but I think you got to be careful what you wish for. If you start, it's like the sweater. the loose thread on a sweater. Once you start pulling on that, who knows where that thing is going to go. So, we do need to think about how we do things more efficiently, and I think clinical development is a ripe area to take a fresh look at. We should also look at, question, our preclinical work and, the time, whether or not there's opportunities to squeeze time out of that. They can really get drugs to market in half the time we do, and there's trade-offs, obviously, there's risks. And, there's a fundamental view is, are you trying to identify things that are just safe? And then you can try to figure out things, whether they work later on. So there's still different fundamental approaches. But I think at the end of the day, this is a real opportunity for us to kind of look at ourselves, take stock, and understand what we're doing good and what we're not doing good. And even on a bigger picture, while everybody's quite anxious over the new head of HSS and what might actually happen, and for good reason. But I would also say that when you spend $4 trillion a year on healthcare, and you have the highest cost per capita in the free world, yet you have the lowest life expectancy in the free world, that we're in fact paying more for less, there's probably opportunities in a lot of areas for us to be more efficient on how we do things.
Yeah, something's amiss. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
so
Y-
my
Do you
thoughts on
do you think that we talked about a shot across the bow and we're kind of retrenching here at the moment. Do you think that we'll see a shift in global biotech leadership away from the US given China's rise? Are we getting to that point or not yet?
You know, I've thought about that a lot, and I think at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that we're still there. I think we're still innovating. I think the breakthroughs and what we're seeing, speak for themselves. But I don't think, you got to also look at what happened to the dinosaur at the end of the day. And you can't rest on your laurels. The fact that they're out patenting us right now, it could be a bunch of crap that they're throwing over the wall. I have no idea what they're filing. But the fact that they're close on an absolute number basis or beating us on an absolute number basis does suggest that should serve as a wake-up call if we want
Yeah,
to continue to maintain our leadership. It's like the hare and the mouse, whatever it was,
the tortoise. Yeah.
the tortoise. You know, if we take too many naps along the way, those guys will get to us. So so no, I think this should serve as a wake-up call. And that's why I think it's so ironic that, really right now, the actions that we've taken has been anything but has been the antithesis of a wake-up call, which I think is frustrating and scaring a lot of folks.
So Alan, where do we go from here? What should we be thinking about in, I guess, the short to midterm? What should we, cross our fingers about? What should we keep an eye out for? Where are we headed? Does the industry have the collective will to make the adjustments and see this as an opportunity to compete, to up our game?
You know, Policymakers, investors, and biopharmaceutical leaders must take proactive steps at this time to ensure innovation remains incentivized while strategically leveraging China's efficiencies. China's biotech emergence isn't a future trend. It's here. Whether it's an opportunity or a challenge depends on how the industry people adapt. The race for innovation is on, and the next decade will determine who leads the next wave of medical breakthroughs. So, I would say right now it's a coin toss, but I think there's still great opportunity for us to grab the bull by the horns. And I think if you look at America, every time it is confronted with a challenge, we know how to innovate, we know how to pivot, and we know how to rationalize things. And, certainly I think the current leadership is not accepting status quo. So on one hand, if you're looking at efficiencies that may be gained from the clinical side, FDA, this might represent a unique opportunity to take a freestanding approach to see if some of those practices can be shed and be more efficient. Uh, um, on the other hand, you know, similar people are making decisions to blow up NIH, which I think may get you a tax cut this year, but I'm not sure what it'll do, 10 years from now. So, again, I think you got to be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is a nice positive and yet nuanced note for us to end on, Alan. We've been speaking with Allan Shaw, biotech soothsayer and longtime friend of this podcast. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at Life Science Leader. We'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.